Well, welcome everyone. I'm Karen Taylor. Oh, I was going to take my mask off just for the beginning here so I can say hello. I'm Karen Taylor and I am the Director of Programs here at the Canadian Canoe Museum. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us here for our first virtual tour of the Artisan and Industry Gallery here at the museum. Before we go any further, I would like to stop to acknowledge that we are here on the Treaty 20 Mississauga territory, part of the traditional territories of Mississauga and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations. We are going to have a virtual tour tonight with our curator, Jeremy Ward, as you all know. And he has been with the museum for over 20 years, I guess it is now, since 1997 in various capacities. And as curator has produced over 20 exhibits, 10 major exhibits, including the one that I'm standing in here now, Artisan and Industry, which is the focus this evening. As many of you know, Jeremy is quite fond of stories of the artifacts in our collection here, many which you can't quite make it onto our text panels that you see when you visit. So getting a bit of a behind the scenes tour here, some stories from Jeremy, and we are in for a treat. Before I go any further and hand it over, I want to just encourage everyone to please share your comments and questions and feedback in the chat. If you're new to Zoom, just look for a little speech bubble icon and you click on that and you'll find a spot to type in your questions for us and your comments. We'll wait until the end of the tour until Jeremy takes those questions for the most part. We have our colleague Rachella is here too, helping facilitate the chat. And maybe we'll just check that that's all working. Invite you to tell us out there where you're visiting us from today. I know there's some folks from around the world, which has been neat to see coming in on the registrations. And we can't actually see those chats rolling in. Rachella can maybe let us know. Oh, I am seeing the bubble rolling in. Actually, Texas, Ontario, Ottawa, awesome. Yeah, that's so great. I'm going to step away, get my mask back on, and turn it over without further ado to Jeremy to explore this gallery with you tonight.
Karen, do you want to spin?
Yep.
Hey, well, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. Before getting started, just listening to Karen, thank you for reminding me it's been over 20 years that I've had the privilege to be here and privileged now to work as its curator. The exhibit we're in, we opened 3 years ago, and it was to explore a century and a half of canoe manufacturing in the Peterborough area. At the time, my colleague and associate curator, Stanley, was on maternity leave, so I'd like to just thank Liz Watkins for working with me on that, and of course a wonderful team of volunteers who were at our site offering support and criticism along the way. That includes Dick Pearson, Ken Brown, and a few others. So thank you for all of your help. Ken, I bet you're online tonight. I'm going to be offering me all kinds of critique tomorrow by email, and I just want to say, if you do visit the museum, we have a copy of Ken's little booklet that sort of spirals around our story tonight, the invention of the board canoe. This is a very Peterborough exploration of the birth of canoe manufacturing here. And then also another book, Ken, it's out of print. It's an absolute treasure trove of information. We'd love to do it in ebooks, so call me and we'll see if we can make that happen. So the guests, if you are interested in this topic, we can give you the resources. Come down to the museum's fabulous gift shop. Now, we are going to walk through the exhibit tonight, jumping in behind the ropes, if you will. That's where I'm wearing gloves. We're going to be handling some precious pieces. And I hope by offering a few stories that you may not notice or read in the text panels, just to add some color to this and do a deeper dive. But I guess behind all of this is I'd like to just sort of probe the question, why is the Canadian Canoe Museum located in Peterborough? Peterborough is located on the Otonabee River, what is now part of what is now called the Trent Severn Waterway System. 3 nearby First Nations, these would be Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Alderville along the water course, with whom we are grateful to have good relations and ongoing support and collaborative effort too. And I think that if the Canoe Museum does anything that it takes anything to heart, it would be in all of that we do as we pursue this themed collection, the canoe, the kayak. If we, wherever possible, acknowledge the continued relationship, the enduring relationship that Indigenous peoples, these are First Nations, Inuit and Métis, have with the canoe and the kayak. And you don't have to look far, certainly in your own backyard, to understand the relationship of the Indigenous peoples in your area to the landscape around them, the traditional territories on where you stand. Certainly here and surrounded by watercraft like that, if we're not looking at a canoe that was from an Indigenous community, it certainly draws inspiration from them. But other things that surprise you as well that just point to the antiquity of that relationship. In my hand is a small tool, ground stone adze used for carving dugout canoes, found by a fisherman, Art, I'll just give his first name, in Rice Lake. And he approached an archaeologist who eventually this made its way to us. And this is a canoe making gouge, thousands of years old, probably quarried at Healy Falls downstream of us, and used for making dugout canoes. And we're going to actually talk about dugout canoes a little bit tonight, so just hold that one in mind. So I said 150 years ago, and eventually, and for about 100 years, Peterborough would be a manufacturing epicenter of canoes for a commercial market. There would be many companies, over 30 names in the region. This is a corridor ranging from Lakefield down to Rice Lake. And the interesting question, I guess, would be, why did it begin here to the strength that it did? And there are a lot of combinations, a lot of opportunities, if you will, that would lead to that. And I'm going to touch on some a little later on, but there were also other hot spots that certainly came about. Thinking of New England and Maine, where we see a large number of canoe manufacturing companies producing wood canvas canoes. Of course, New Brunswick, we see Chestnut Canoe Company. A little later out in Vancouver, Greenwood Canoes, and a whole host of other canoe factories and companies between New Brunswick and Vancouver here in Canada. But Peterborough produced so many different companies, so many different patented methods of working with wood to produce wooden canoes for about 100 years. And that it really is, it argues, I suppose, if you will, that this is the birthplace of canoe manufacturing. Now, looking at the historical record, as you see the early interactions between First Nations in the area here and the settler population. 1830, we see a settler family, and this would be Samuel Strickland, in the record carving a dugout canoe. This is hewing away a log, first sculpted on the outside, and then the remainder removed from the inside till the thickness was achieved. And his first effort in 1830 said looked more like a hog trough than a canoe, but it planted a seed in the family. And meanwhile, in the summers, Peterborough is surrounded by rivers and lakes. It was also, at one point, the home of incredible white cedar, which lends itself beautifully to canoe making, to the point where it was exporting cedar, even across the border for canoe manufacturing. And it was also a burgeoning industrial center. There were so many different industries in the area that could lend themselves to this new industry. Now, what an industry needs is a market, and where that market was growing was actually on the water. So all this leads us back to the water. Behind me is a beautiful panorama taken in 1910, a little later, up on Stony Lake. And Stony Lake was a really important, informative area for the canoe manufacturing. And we'll touch on that, but there were these gatherings in the summer, but also upstream from there and downstream were these summer gatherings on the water, where sailing, rowing, and canoeing would take place. So with Strickland's canoe made in 1930 in my hand, I have a newspaper ad, and there's a lot of reading on here, but this is the Rice Lake Regatta, 1849. And you'll see if you read carefully, let's see if I can get in close, that the heats, the canoe races below all the sailing events, the heats were segregated. You have the Indian races and then the whites races, the white canoeing races. And the perhaps the segregation had racist elements to it. And that's a condition that we all know persists to today, I'm sorry to say. I think perhaps that you might look playfully and say, well, maybe the segregation was also in place in order to provide an opportunity for the non-Indigenous, the white paddlers, if you will, to actually pick up a trophy. These are 1849, this is early days. The canoe is a new idea in a way to settlers to the area. And birch bark canoe making was utterly foreign, I think it's safe to say, to newcomers to the area. The technology is very different, the skill and expertise to go to the bush, identify the materials you need, and then to bring it back, prep the materials, and build a canoe from the outside in. It's a complete inversion to most methods of boat building that came over from Europe. And so what we find is that the settler population in this area was more comfortable taking a log and shaping it into a canoe. The son of the Sam Strickland, whose first canoe looked like a hog trough, this is George in 1857. He shows up at a race with his greatest creation, which is a polished basswood dugout canoe named Shooting Star. And he does well at the Lakefield regattas, comes down to Peterborough and eventually to Rice Lake, where unfortunately he lost to the so-called Indian team who were paddling in a dugout canoe called Flying Cloud. And so you can see at that point then these regattas were doing mixed events. And this will go on. What's really important is what's happening in the background. And this is a crowd gathered, perhaps took the steamer down the Otonabee River to catch this event, or taking it up on Stony Lake or Chemong Lake or the other gatherings, and watching this and eventually saying, well, I want to get in on that. And you have the year after George Strickland's dugout canoe shows up and does rather well, one individual, this is John Stevenson, who takes his old dugout canoe that he loved. Now dugouts, one problem with them is they crack and they split. And John had taken an old dugout that he enjoyed. He was a blacksmith and a talented man in many different trades. And he bent ribs over the outside of that dugout canoe. And he laid thin boards on the outside of the ribs. And he drove fastenings through the planking, through the ribs, right into the dugout. And this is sort of the origin story, I guess, for canoe manufacturing in this area, which relies upon a mold. It's a bit like a shoemaker building shoes in pieces over the last for a shoe. And that is a method that persisted all through canoe manufacturing in this area until the industry finally sort of wrapped up in the 60s and 70s. So I'm going to take you now into a small canoe building shop just to my left, to your right. And I'd like to just walk you through a few things that we have here. I'm wearing white gloves tonight because they need to come on and go off regularly, and the nitriles, the blue gloves are hard to put on and off. In front of me, this is a canoe building mold from the 1930s. This is a Lakefield. It's a 13-foot sweetheart of a little canoe. It looks like a canoe, and it also looks like a dugout. It has some ribs bent over it there, as you can see. But it's neither. It is actually built to be the form over which a canoe would be built. And in fact, thousands of canoes would be built. You can see we've laid it out here. There is a center strip here, an inner keel, a bent stem piece at one end, and we've begun laying ribs over top. And I just want to show you sort of the beginning steps. Once you've established that, that longitudinal central framework, I have a steam box behind me, and I'm going to pull out a rib. Now, this is oak. It's a hardwood. It's shaped in a half round. And if you, I can find it, there's a little slot that each rib would tuck into. And having been in the steam box for about 20 minutes, goes on very quickly. And I'm just grateful that while we're filming, the rib didn't crack on me. That does happen on occasion, but no video touch-ups needed. You can see on this canoe, on this mold, there are these lugs. It looks a bit like an alligator skin, and these are there, of course, to center the ribs, to keep everything, the rhythm of the framework, all nicely laid out as you're putting it together. The interesting next step then is to plank up the hull. You're going to lay long strips of cedar that have a shape to them. They taper at their ends. Remember, canoes are wider at the middle. This is really part of the conundrum for a canoe maker, is how do you account for the taper of a hull? And there's a whole bewildering array of ways that the local canoe makers devised to do that, to build both a lightweight hull made of wood that also keeps the water out. Now remember, wood bends, but it does not stretch. And you cannot create a three-dimensional form out of wood without having seams. And what this community was known for was all of the different patented ways of engineering, of forming wood over a mold in ways that kept the water out for the paddle, which is always good. One of the earliest patented methods is this one, which I have to say is probably the hardest. Now, this, if I'm holding it this way, and you can sort of see the up and down lines, the planking is actually made of ribs going around the hull. John Stevenson, that fellow who bent ribs and built a canoe over a dugout, he patented this in 1879. We have his original patent in our archive. And so each rib touches its neighbor, and it has a tongue on one side and a groove on the next, and they have to be bent into place, lowered down, and carefully nested into the joinery of the preceding rib, held in place. Another one's brought over, brought in, snuggled into place, and locked in, and so on and so forth. And you eventually build a smooth hull out of ribs. Now, it sounds easy, just like we bent this rib. It's not. The problem being that as this hull tapers, you need to taper those ribs as they come up the side. And so I would imagine, never having built one, you're going to have to put a rib on, then take it off, take a plane out, and snick off a wedge on either end, reset that little tongue or the groove joinery on it, put it in place, and bring it in, all without breaking the joinery of the preceding board. There's about 65 steps that follow that, all of which I can't imagine exactly how they were done. So I'm pretty sure the Cedar Rib Canoes can't be built. I've said this before, and yet we have 7 in our collection, and I've seen dozens more. Of course they can, but it is an incredible piece of woodworking. Stevenson also developed and patented probably the most common all-wood canoe construction method. This is the Cedar Strip. It's a classic, if you will. These half-round ribs are bent over the mold. Those longitudinal planks held in place. Each one tucks underneath. But there are so many other ways. Down in New England, or Old Town and that area, the wood canvas reigned. And this was a way of making a wooden hull that did not need to be watertight. You're building it over a steel banded mold. You can see one in the upper corner there. You don't need to move the camera, Karen, thank you. But in fact, the wood planking just butts up to each other because at the end of the day, the whole canoe is going to get a canvas skin over top. Once it's finished, the canvas is waterproofed and painted. So that's another way. That was not devised locally. One method that was used here to a lesser degree, much more in the Adirondacks, J.H. Rushton was known for these lap straight canoes. And if you look at the planking, these would run this way. Excuse me, I got it wrong. It's that way on the mold. And this takes us back to Viking days with the longboats and even before that. It's a very stiff, lightweight structure. Each plank fastens to its next, and then the ribs are added later. So a little bit of an inversion to the method, but never quite as popular here. There's a whole host of other methods that we could get into. We could get all tangled up into that. But I find I really enjoy looking at, and the museum's collection has dozens and dozens and dozens, in fact, hundreds of different expressions of canoe making using all wood or different ways of wrapping wood around these compound forms, that even if you're not a boat builder, if you're interested in wood, or if you're interested in architecture, frankly, there's a lot to be learned from this. Now, Karen, over my head is an interesting feature because I'm standing in front of the 13-foot mold, and right above, if you can see, is, there we go. This is a sweetheart of a canoe that was lifted right off of this mold. this was made by an old friend of the Canadian Canoe Museum. I'm sorry we lost him in 2009, Walter Walker. You recognize Walter if you visited the museum because there's quite a bit of him displayed at the museum. And he's important to us for a number of reasons. Walter had a long career, as I said, he lived to 102. He was a canoe maker for about 70, 75 years. And I think when I look at his career, what he can really offer us to a researcher is he was a traditionalist. He was a perfect time capsule of a tradition. He comes into the industry at its heyday in the 1930s, 40s, and he learns the craft as a canoe maker at that time when it's at its zenith. And he rides with that industry as slowly after the Second World War, the industry and the markets for wooden canoes constricts and contracts. And he works with a number of companies, each smaller than the previous, until the local wooden canoe manufacturing industry was completely closed and gone. And he continues building canoes in his basement for 25 years. Well, I remember some years ago, I was building a wood canvas canoe here at the museum. We were going to raffle it off. And Walter graciously offered to come in and work with me one day a week on it. And it gave me an opportunity to work with him. There are many who have been involved with the museum who had a chance to hang around him and watch him work. He did some amazing projects with us. And so I had an opportunity to work at one end of the canoe while Walter was working at the other end of my wood canvas. And what I'd set up for this one day is that we were going to notch the stems. Now, Karen, if you can see my hands a little bit more, the stem pieces are these big, the framework that describes the cutwater. And on a canvas canoe, you have more notches than this because you're going to have all these ribs coming up, setting into grooves you've cut or notches into the stems as you bend them over. You want a nice snug fit before you plank the hull. Now, Walter comes in just after 8 o'clock, takes his coat off, puts his tools down. He's at his end, I'm at mine. I've laid out the notches. I have tools for myself. I know he brings his own. And I'm there with my saw, chopping away. You need to make a series of cuts, one next to the other. Take a chisel and a mallet, and you're knocking out those wooden teeth you've just cut with the saw. Take a rasp, round it out. Take a scrap piece of wood that's a rib. Make sure you have a nice tight fit. And there I am. I'm pretty happy with my first notch for the day. And I look over, and he has his back saw, and he's making cuts. He probably makes 6 or 7 for these wider notches. And he goes, one, another one, about 1/4 of an inch, not even to the side of it, and he tips his back saw. Now, if you're a tool fetishist, this is not a great thing to do to your tool. It does flatten the kerf set on your teeth. But he just uses his saw essentially as a screwdriver or a pry bar, and he taps out these teeth as he works his way along. Quick nibble with a chisel, takes a piece of wood, puts it down, moves on to the next one. And by the time I'd finished one notch, he'd finished the entire stem, and he was moving on. And I was thinking at the time, look, now Walter, I'm making a canoe at the Canadian Canoe Museum. Honestly, I have to tell you, I'm not a canoe builder. I've had the privilege of hanging around them. And I spend a lot of time talking about them. So I'm a much better canoe talker than a canoe maker. But I'd wanted to sort of turn it on for this little canoe that we were building. But then I got to thinking, and you can't help but think this, when you watch somebody whose hands, his joinery was perfect, but he did not waste time where it was not needed. And in the factory, on the factory floor, Walter learned these lessons where you're really balancing production with quality. Quality will bite you if it's not good enough because you get returns, and yet they had to meet the volume that they were producing. And so Walter gave me some insight now how he would achieve that too. I heard we used to host dinners with retired canoe builders in the area, and the old timers, the old canoe makers would talk about Walter's penknife because he was a foreman. He'd oversee all the canoe building on the floor. And after you had finished planking up a canoe on the mold, before you sawed it off, he'd walk down and he'd inspect the joinery on one side, come down along the other. And they talked about out would come the pocket knife, just a little one about this big, unfold it, and he'd just nibble at it on a plank maybe that you should not have used, or you should have cut it shorter set the taper, put a seam there rather than cheating and left a pin knot in or a crack or a check. And so he'd just sit there and worry at a piece of wood with his pocket knife until you couldn't sand it out. Close the knife, and then he'd walk on and go on to the next form. So not a man of words, but certainly it gave me a lot to think about as I watched him. And I'm glad to have had a chance to see hands that worked in that kind of production. Walter, he was a master in his craft, but I'm introducing him tonight because he was one of hundreds, and he was the embodiment of a tradition, if you will. He gifted to the Canadian Canoe Museum hundreds and hundreds of artifacts from the industry. That's the molds we have, patterns around us. He was a traditionalist of his type, and I feel like he's a very good representative of an era that we will never see again, where you see this kind of mass production, if you will, of hand-built objects that are wooden canoes. For instance, Walter was known for his paddles, a distinctive shaped paddle that has these little hips you can see there just at the throat of the blade. Beautiful paddle. And another hip right below the grip. I'm going to hold it against my vest so you can see that. I don't know if you can see that. And this was a distinctive paddle known as the Walter Walker paddle locally for decades, until after he passed away and he willed to us all of his tools and equipment. And my colleague Beth and I spent many days excavating his basement workshop. And there, lo and behold, down in there was a paddle pattern. And this is not a paddle, it's a big thick slab of cedar. It's been stiffened with a bang iron or a stem band from a canoe to keep the shaft straight. And there you can see that grip. You can see that by my shoulder. And again, the blade, the shape of the blade, it's all a classic. And if I can, bring that right in. Where are we? I'm going to point to there. You can see 1895. And so this came out of the Gordon Canoe Factory in Lakefield. But Walter recognized it for a perfect piece of design and carries it on like he did everything else. And so it gives us that long view into the history of this industry. So thank you, Walter, for that. Of course, in the area, there's also all of the side bits that come out of the industry. These are copper nail casks. Many of them mark Peterborough Canoe Company. And if you look at that, it says copper, wire, canoe, nails. This would have contained thousands upon thousands of canoe nails, hundreds of canoes perhaps would come out of a cask like that. And just part of the lateral industry that supported this, this business locally. Good. Okay, well, I'm going to move us along. I'd like to introduce you to a few canoes. I'm going to come around this side. Karen, do you want to join me? So a few canoes here that are important to this story, if you will. The one lowest down by my hip is a dugout canoe. It's a basswood canoe, and nice, well-made hull. You can see what a conservator, museum conservator, would call the inherent vice. This is repairs to cracking. Dugout canoes, because you have all of the wood fibers wrapped around the center of the log. As the wood expands and contracts with moisture, and over time, you get these radial splits that end up coming into the side of the hull. So if you look on the inside of this dugout canoe, you see ribs. Now, I mentioned John Stevenson had taken his cherished dugout canoe and bent ribs over the outside and then laid planking, nailed it together, and pulled the wooden canoe off of this dugout. These ribs are here just to hold those cracks closed, or at least to stabilize them, so that the canoeist could continue to repair a dugout canoe. The time investment in this is considerable, and you can see how you try to squeak another season out of your dugout canoe, thereby leading to the need for canoes produced en masse. What's also lovely about this one is it carries the classically Peterborough stylings to the all-wood canoe. The gunnels, it's a single gunnel. It's on the outside. It's a long, deep shelf as opposed to what we expect on wood canvas canoes, which are more like square blocks. So it has that shelf gunnel, the big decks with the center strip up the middle, and then this important combing here, which ties together all the joinery, hides the end grain, and just sort of finishes off the overall look. And you'll see this in so many of the canoes that came out of this region. Above it is quite a humble but absolutely amazing canoe. Her name's Regatta, and this is the only canoe in our collection that we know was made over a mold, over a dugout, excuse me, not over a mold. We know that because in the late 1800s, George Douglas and his brother Lionel pull an old racing dugout canoe out of the mud. Don't know if it came from the Strickland family or who made it originally. But they dragged it home, and the father, Dr. Campbell Mellis Douglas, these are all names that you'll see in other exhibits here at the museum. But Campbell Douglas took it down to Thomas Gordon in Lakefield, a canoe builder of note, a very important canoe maker, and asked Thomas to build a canoe over this dugout. So what we have here is not the dugout that was found in the mud, but in fact, a canoe built over the outside of it. We know this from the family history. You can also tell if you look at it from the end on, it's very narrow, very, very sleek. It doesn't resemble any of the known manufactured hulls that we have. Regatta herself has a very interesting story. In his later days, the father, Campbell, took this canoe to England in his retirement. Before he passed away, he paddled it on the Thames River. It has a license plate on it, renewable in 1900. If you wanted to paddle on the Thames, you needed to have a conservation license attached to your canoe or your boat. And he would get out there in Regatta with a double paddle and tool around. And after the father's passing, after Father Campbell died, George went to England in large part just to bring the canoes home that his dad had taken to England. So that's part of the family business. Another name I haven't mentioned who was an important player is overhead, and this is William English. And if the lighting didn't have a shadow there, you'd see William's name on it. William was a builder just across town. You can't see his canoe factory anymore because, like all of the canoe factories, most of the self-respecting canoe factories at some point, they burn down. You've got a lot of wood heat, steam, you have linseed oil, rags, varnish, cigarettes going around, cedar shavings everywhere. And when these factories go, of course, the last thing to get dragged out are the molds because they're so big and heavy. And so when the canoe factories close down, if they manage to rebuild after a fire, you'd have to start with a whole new suite of molds again. But William English's canoe factory was on Charlotte Street. The Ontario Canoe Company was over in East City, Peterborough, multiple locations Canadian. They're all gone, I'm sorry to say, except for the last showroom for Peterborough Canoe Company, which is just down the road from us here. Okay, well, listen, we're going to head over to another section. Come on along. Trying to keep the tripod and the camera as steady as we can. You're doing a great job, Karen. Thanks. Well, I'm going to introduce you to some pretty passable, pretty believable canoes, except they're in miniature. And these are a really interesting part of the business, a colorful part of the business. I'm just going to tip that down just a kiss. Oh, it's not going to go. There's no point in having an industry if you can't get the word out to reach your market. And so what we have in this part of the exhibition are a number of sort of different features of the industry that got the word out to the public. These are models of canoes. Behind me are a number of wonderful American canoe models from different American companies. We'll see some Canadian ones in a second. Names you may or may not have heard of north of the border, Carlton Canoe Company, Old Town Canoe Company, Kennebec, E.M. White, Garish, and so on. These salesman samples, as they've been called, don't be misled. They're not like vacuums or encyclopedias going door to door. These were used in showrooms, perhaps. They might be gifted to a top retailer. But they would also carry all of the lines and construction techniques and everything else of the larger craft. A lot of these are a fifth the scale or thereabouts. and eminently collectible. They're very rare. And I just wanted to give a shout out to a good friend of the museum, Roger Young, who has been involved in so much of the work around the Canoe Museum. And these are all from Roger's collection, with the exception of one that I'm gonna hold in my hand in a sec. But Roger has put together a lot of incredible collection of these canoe models. That leads us into this other part of the business. Roger's also been a terrific help in exhibits as well. So thank you, Roger. I think you're online with us tonight. Now, Karen, if you want to follow me over here. This is the one I was mentioning. This is new to the museum. It was gifted by the Pulver family here locally. The family had a canoe maker at Peterborough Canoe Company in the family, and so this has been in the family. I would guess this is probably late 20s, early 30s. But if you look at it, it's not distorted at all for being a miniature. It's as elegant as the full-size canoes. The construction details are perfect, and you can imagine down on a showroom floor how useful this would be without the real estate taken up by a full-size canoe. This features floorboards, a collapsible seat. Even the paddles are exquisite. And this is a canvas-covered model. But just like the full-size versions, these models have to be built on a mold. And we have in the museum's collection an enormous steam box from the Stark family who worked with Peterborough. The steam box is probably 12 feet long, cast iron, weighs as much as a car, and would be used for steaming the hardwood, the big hardwoods like the stem pieces and so on. And this is a building mold for these salesman samples, about 5 feet long. You can see it's had some wear and tear over the years. But this was used for making wide board, one of the earliest methods of canoe building in the area. And as far as I can see, at least dozens were pulled off of this mold. Rugged, but carries all of the scars of the manufacturing with it. Behind it is a delicious sampling from the Ontario and mostly from the Peterborough area. We see wide-board construction and a few others. And in the back, remember that Cedar Rib Canoe, right? The whole canoe is made out of ribs. There'll be little skinny sticks on the inside that they're nailed to, but each rib tongue and grooves to its neighbor, so you get a whole hull made out of these ribs. Well, behind there, it says Ontario Canoe Company on the side on a decal. This is a model of this long. The planking must be as thick as a piece of cardboard, like a packing crate cardboard box, if that. And each rib has been tongued and grooved to fit to its neighbor. And honestly, the delicacy of the work and the perfection of it is really quite incredible. I cannot imagine building a full-size one. Now I'm imagining building one that's only 5 feet long, working with these tiny materials, miniature tacks that are driven through and clinched over to lock them into place, just like the full-size canoe. I gotta say, the woodworking, the artistry, and the technique in this area, like many places, but it was really, truly exceptional. And as to woodworkers today, I have to say, pretty humbling. You know, it's interesting, those Cedar Rib canoes, like all of the wooden canoes, you could get them varnished with copper fastenings. If you look at the catalogs, they had different price points for every offering. They'd offer to modify it for you at a price if you wanted a little bit deeper or a little longer, what have you. And they also offered everything in, or pretty much everything, also in paint grade. So I imagine if you take a masterpiece like one of those Cedar Rib canoes, and then you paint it, right? And it's a hard-wearing finish. You're going to use it for what have you. To the modern eye, it would look like fiberglass. And you know, we are today so sentimental about when we see things wood. We often take Victorian houses and strip away all the painted, all the grained trim that originally would have even been painted. And we varnish it and so on in ways because we love to celebrate when we've come a distance from it. But in the day, the companies offered a premium grade canoe, but they also offered a low-end budget hunting canoe to leave up at the camp, and all of the amenities were left out of it. It was a stripped-down model, and it was very simple. Now, just behind my head, I don't know if you can follow my hand, is a small tribute to the fact that all of these companies did not just produce canoes. Certainly after the Second World War, there was a growing appetite for all kinds of other pieces. During the war, the canoe companies, certainly Peterborough Canoe Company, made skis for aircraft, crash boats for recovering downed pilots and so on. And on the wall is just a taste of what, for instance, the Peterborough Canoe Company turned out, including the early versions of a wakeboard called the aqua board, water skis, snowshoes, duck hunting decoys, and of course the runabouts and the powerboats. And by the 1950s, it's safe to say that the powerboat and the runabout market was bigger than the canoe market. And so the Peterborough name, Peterborough Canoe Company, really became synonymous then with Cedar Strip motorboats as well. Okay, one last little stop here before we get to questions, and I'm going to take you into a workshop. Oh, I almost forgot. You want to come around this side, Karen? Just going to open the case. I've mentioned a lot of names tonight who have been involved with the museum over the years and supported us. And dear friend Roger Mcgregor is certainly one of them. Roger was a historian, wrote about canoe manufacturing when Chestnut was in flower, also available, I think, in our gift shop. And he gifted to the museum an astonishing collection of archival material, probably the most comprehensive collection of archival materials from the Canadian canoe manufacturing industry, predominantly based in Peterborough. But I want you to just take a look at this. Most of this comes from Roger's collection, and I've added a few other pieces here. In the days before Photoshop, when you want to get the word out, of course, the catalog for these companies was a primary vehicle for that information. And here we are at the Lakefield Canoe Company. And here's a brand new contrasting strip, longitudinal strip canoe. So they've got light and dark strips of cedar for the hull. In the background, you can see a burly canoe builder in his coveralls. On the other side, from the Roy studio, you can see a gentleman in a top hat. Could be Roy himself. And they're up behind the factory with a stretched piece of canvas to help in post-production, crop out the background, get away the clutter of the factory to get this canoe into a catalog. Now, just to its left, you'll see, and I'm going to lift this up because there's a bit of glare, I think. There is that canoe photograph rendered, cropped by the studio. You can see the contrasting strip. And beneath it, as it appears in the catalog, worked in with all the text. Now, how do they get it to the text? How do they get it to the catalog itself? That image would be worked into these engraved printing blocks. We have a number of these. These came from the Bush Canoe Company up in Coldwater, Ontario. A charming little collection of these print blocks of different kinds of canoes. You can even see the detailing in this of combing, rib ends, and so on that are attached to the canoes. Very faithfully done. We've done, of course, printings off of these with a local printing press just to get the proper rendering of it. And even some whimsy. So this is a charming little one. This is actually two frogs, not humans. One has a parasol. And this was rendered into a postcard my colleague Beth found online, and we now have in our collection. But it was done as a sweet little postcard. Now, moving just a little past there, you have these printed images from the engraving blocks, now taken to an artist. This is J.D. Kelly. And he was based down around Rice Lake, south of Peterborough. And he's taken those engravings and he's worked up all of the artist's recommendations for the print shop, reduced to 6.5 inches. He's color toned it. He's done all of the cleanups and so on for the different pieces. And I love this because even in the business of selling canoes, the artist has taken a moment on the back page and he's drawn himself in. There's old JD with his big mustache and he's reading a book. He's drifting. This is on the back page of the catalog. He's drifting in a canoe named Idler, and that's in one of the Rice Lake Canoe Company catalogs. Okay, one last stop. Here we go. You're going to follow me into our workshop, as I promised. So welcome to the Living Traditions Workshop. This is one of our classrooms and one of our demonstration areas here at the Canoe Museum. If you visit us over the years, you'd know this is a really DIY, hands-on kind of place. We teach courses right here in the exhibits. Right now, because of COVID, there's a protective screen, of course, to protect our guests, and also to allow our canoe makers and boat builders. Russ Parker is our skin-on-frame boat builder in-house. Right now, he's doing a beautiful interpretation of the Adirondack guide boat, but he's doing it in a skin-on-frame construction. So this is pre-laminated ribs, and it'll be stretched over with a skin like an Inuit kayak when it's done. Ultralight is the goal with this, trying to build a hopped-up, high-speed version. And the Adirondack guide boat in its day was reputed to be the fastest fixed-seat rowboat, traditional rowboat in the world. So they claim. Used for hunting and fishing, taking sport hunters out, the hunting guides would build them themselves. So, a bit of a sidebar, this is a place where we teach courses, we do demonstrations, people learn about working with their hands, and it's fitting that for his contribution to the Canoe Museum and for giving us the glimpse into a much larger industry, we decided to name this for Walter Walker. You can see a picture of him taken by Michael Peake up at Peel Marine, which was Walter's last stop in a proper canoe shop before retiring to his basement. And there's Walter. He's setting the nails on a canoe that's been pulled off a mold. And above it, he was not a man of many words. And I love this quote for somebody who built canoes for over 70 years. You just keep doing it and doing it because you like doing it. Thank you, Walter. Okay, well, we're going to open up now, I think, to questions. Our time, time is good.
Hi, Jeremy. It's Rochella here. So we had one question from someone that I think has some insider information, because they would like you to mention Bob's Special that was behind you when you were back by the model canoes, and that's coming from W. Bruce Clark.
Of course it's coming from W. Bruce Clark. Hi, Bruce. This is, I know, your very favorite canoe. The one we walked by had an owner that most of us will know. It belonged to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And the Bob's Special came from the Chestnut Canoe Company in Fredericton. Do we want to walk there and have a peek? Okay, well, we're going to walk and have a look at Trudeau's canoe. We have two canoes here at the museum that belong to Pierre Trudeau, loaned to us by the family. And this one is a birch bark canoe that was a wedding gift for Pierre and Margaret in 1971. But this is a much earlier chestnut, comes out of New Brunswick. At the far end of the words in French, ça ira, which means, I'll be corrected on this, but ça ira is like, it'll be okay, it'll do all right, it'll go. And I love this canoe because it's evident that Trudeau paddled this one a great deal more than the birch bark canoe. It's been field repaired inside all over the place, many coats of paint, but lovingly worked over to keep going, and nothing lost for the repairs, just a bit more to the story. Bob's Special was a 15-footer. It's a beloved canoe. Certainly, I know people with the same last name as you, Mr. Clark, who love their Bob's Special. And we've joked about this in the past. It's not my favorite, I'll say that. They're wide. I like a 16-foot canoe, if you're wanting to know. And what one telltale of the Bobs is that the ends don't have that dramatic uplift. They're actually quite flat on their ends. They're very stable, and they're sort of a great all-purpose canoe. And named after Lord Roberts, who was involved in the Boer War. Not a tall man, and so maybe they named a shorter canoe after Bob's, as he was his nickname. So maybe that answers your question. Any others?
We do have some others.
Sorry about the glare on my head. I can't really
So from Chris Taryn in Ottawa, how do you prevent all the natural materials of the canoes, cedar, birch bark, animal skins on Inuit boats, etc., in the collection from deteriorating over time?
That is a really great question. I'm not a museum conservator, not by training, and I have a lot of respect for the skills involved there. At this point, the Canadian Canoe Museum is not a Class A facility in the conservation standards. So if you can hear a background noise, what you're hearing are the steam generators that are managing the humidity fluctuations in the museum. We of course have ultraviolet free lighting at the museum and so on. But the goal of the museum, of course, is to build a new facility and keep your ear to the ground. We're always making announcements about that project. Some more will be coming up before long. To give a proper home for a museum, an important collection like this. So some things you can manage quite easily just by managing the environment that they're left with. Some other things are much more challenging. And you know, dugout canoes, kayaks, you have this incredible battle of internal forces going on with the way they're constructed. I mentioned inherent vice before, which is the way an object is assembled causes it to do damage to itself over time. And if you look at the kayaks, you will often see tears on them where the skins have constricted so much that they've actually given way and torn. And I remember having a guest in from Greenland. He's an Inuit kayak paddler. And I was showing him one kayak from near his community. And he said, oh, you have to take the skins off of this. That's what we would have done after a couple of years, just because over time they continue. It needs a new suite of skins. From a museum perspective, there's going to be a real challenge because to take the skin off, you are removing that female contribution, the woman's work that was put onto these hulls, and it would take a great deal away from the object itself. So we try to be guided by the expertise that we'll find in the communities that we're in. We've not had the courage to remove the skins just yet from all of the kayaks. And so there they are, bearing in mind that from a conservation perspective, they might call these proofed objects. These objects were originally designed to get plopped in the water, out in the sun, pulled up on shore. And so a lot of the stresses that they may go through over time actually occurred during their lifetime. Another question, Rachel?
Yeah, so we have a general one. So I hope you've got your math hat on here, Jeremy. How is the Canoe Museum funded?
How are we funded? Well, we are a private, not-for-profit, non-government museum. A bit of an upstart, always have been. This began as a private collection at a summer camp and eventually needed a new home, came down to Peterborough, and with an old and abandoned outboard motor factory, we've been building this. A team of volunteers and then later staff rallied to this project. And so every year, we raise the funds to operate this museum, and indeed to building a new museum with the support of grants. So that's grants with the federal government, provincial government. The city has always been a deep supporter for the Canadian Canoe Museum, and through philanthropy. Predominantly philanthropy. I think less than 10% of our operating funds every year come from the government.
Great. So far, this is the last question, unless anyone else wants to type in the chat. But what's the most recent canoe in the museum?
Oh, what a good question. Okay, I will answer that with a beautiful canoe that is not here in the exhibits. It's in storage. We haven't worked it into an exhibition yet. It's the coolest thing. This is a wartime technology, molding mahogany veneer, thin layers of wood laid diagonally over a form baked in a special furnace called an autoclave, which is high pressure vacuum heat to activate the glues. Now, this is a technology that was developed, really perfected in the war to make, if you're an airplane buff, to make mosquito fighter bombers, where they were making the Wooden Wonder, these wooden airplanes that could carry 1,000-pound bombs. Incredibly strong without needing to use metal. Well, after the war, that technology was really picked up by a number of companies. And in Winnipeg, a propeller factory got in on this and formed a company called Flycraft Canada. And a backer family in Winnipeg called the Richardson family, a very significant family in Winnipeg, supporting that industry in Flycraft, supported the canoe building enterprise there. And a member of the family, Kathleen Richardson, had a canoe for most of her life. She became an important member of the community there, an inspiring philanthropist in Winnipeg. And so we have a beautiful molded veneer beautiful piece of, I'd say, mid-century modern taken to canoe making, made out of molded veneer with KMR, with her initials on the side of the canoe. I love it. It's exquisite. We will have it into an exhibit before long.
Beautiful. This question, I think, comes from someone familiar, Carolyn Hislop. Our executive director. She wants to know the age-old question, what is your favorite canoe, Jeremy?
Wow. You know, that changes every day. It really does. Kind of depends what we're looking at the time. In fact, you know what I'm going to say? It's probably right now, it's that Richardson, that Flycraft canoe. I still haven't quite worked that into a new exhibit narrative yet. But every time I walk behind it, I wish I'd known I'd be asked, we would have brought it up to show it to you. It's just so elegant and beautiful. And it's bridging the gap between the hand-built industry of clinched fastenings and that ancient technique and very contemporary composite methods, but using it has all the beauty of wood worked into it. So I'm going to go with that one. How about Flycraft Canada?
The chat is now flying. We have lots of questions coming in. From Dave Crosby, I'm in Scotland and have a canvas wood strip canoe, 17 feet. How can I tell if it's from Canada?
Well, first steps would be to reach out to the Canadian Canoe Museum. And what we're going to do is ask you for measurements and photographs, and we can help you from there. So if you want to reach out to info@canoemuseum.ca, that might be the best start, and you'll probably end up on my screen and we'll have a conversation. And I will tell you, if I don't know the answer, if we can't help idea it, we have a number of friends out there, probably some of them are watching us tonight, who can help us as well.
Absolutely. Jen Bernard would like to know, what's your position on aluminum canoes?
Well, it's a love-hate, I have to say. An aluminum canoe was the first canoe in my family. It's a 17-foot lightweight Grumman. Actually, I did a post on this some time ago. It was for Canoe Hug Day. And that old tanker was my introduction to canoe tripping with family as a young guy. And I remember wipeouts at Palmer Rapids as we were training to do the Des Moines. And of course, aluminum is just so bad at grabbing rocks, and so you end up skidding to a halt and flying out of your seat and so on. But there's something really near and dear to my heart about that canoe, because it led me here, and it's still part of my life. It's actually down on the dock, and it's the one that probably gets paddled most because it can live in the water for the full season. There's some nicer boats, but they're out of sight, of course, because they may disappear. And the Grumman's just always there, always at the ready.
You might have answered this next question then. What canoe do you actually paddle?
Right now, not that one. I have a stunning canoe given to me by the family of George Lustig. George is the founder of the Wilderness Canoe Symposium, and daughter Tia gave me a Kevlar composite canoe made by Russell Miller. And I know Karen, who's running the camera tonight, her family tripped in Miller canoes. Miller's passed away sadly, but made fabulous composite canoes. And I really like him. It's a great big thing. It's almost 18 feet. It's a tripping boat, but it has such great lines, and I'm not afraid of a big canoe. I'm not a big fan of the littler ones, although occasionally they're great, Bruce. But right now, the 18-footer is a joy to paddle.
This one comes from Peter Callens. Please clarify regarding chestnut canoes. What is the difference between an official chestnut and chestnut style?
Well, okay, that's a really interesting question. I'm not quite sure what chestnut style is, but maybe what comes to mind is if you look at anything made today by most of the canoe companies, not anything made by them, but most of the major canoe companies, and a lot of the smaller shops making Kevlar, fiberglass, and so on, they're going to offer you a chestnut prospector. The reason for that, we can blame good old Bill Mason, and just around the corner is Bill Mason's beloved red chestnut prospector, gifted to the Canadian Canoe Museum by by Bill's family, Joyce, Paul, and Becky. Becky paddled it on the last day before it came in, and we received it with gloves. And Bill wrote that he thought it the best sort of all-round canoe, and it's a big one. You know, in car comparisons, it might be more of a minivan to a sedan, but a great canoe, originally designed for prospecting and that kind of hard work in the bush. Now, why that's relevant is a lot of companies that are making a canoe marked as a prospector, what they resemble to the prospector is the name, and in fact, they've reduced the depth, the width, and they've even put in some hollows, say, to the ends, making it more usable for two people who are not carrying an 800-pound outfit on the floor of the canoe. So how do we identify chestnuts? Well, there are a few indicators that are a good start. The shape of the ribs, particularly as you look up as they come up the sides. They had an unusual way of back cutting or tapering the ribs before they tuck into the gunnels. The one behind me is probably pre-1921, before chestnut burned down and had to build all its molds again. And another canoe factory that burned. But we can often tell by the ribs. The numbering that may be stamped on them is problematic with chestnut. None of the Canadian canoe companies are like Old Town in Maine, which, God love them. If you can find the numbers in an Old Town canoe company, Benson Gray out there will be able to direct you to the original work order that told you not only who put the canvas on and what year, but what color it was painted. So chestnuts can be a little bit beguiling, a bit challenging, and another bit of confusion comes from the fact that in 1923, Chestnut, Canadian, and Peterborough, the big three canoe manufacturers in Canada, stopped competing and they merged under an umbrella corp called Canadian Watercraft. And now they start filling orders for each other. So down in Fredericton, you might see them finishing off a Chestnut canoe and putting a Peterborough Canoe Company decal on one end. And for that reason, then we call those Peter nuts, because you can see it's made, it has the telltales of chestnut, but the decal's not right, and so on. And that's just because of that the company merges. So it's a good question. It's a bit of a tangle, but that just points to a few elements of that. Michelle.
So after hearing about the newest canoe in the collection, what is the oldest canoe?
What is the oldest canoe? I guess by date, when it was made or when it was used, because the first canoe in the museum's collection when it belonged to the summer camp is a Dugout Canoe. It was made not far from here. It is a classic of that Peterborough tradition, and it hangs in an exhibit made in Warsaw, Ontario, not far from my house. But the oldest canoe in the museum's collection, we have 7 Dugout canoes that came out of the bottoms of lakes and rivers. These are rotten old hulks. They might be a log, but in fact, if you look closely, you'll see that they are tapered and pointed at the ends. They have something of a hull to them. They've been carved out to a floor. Most of ours, you can actually see evidence of steel tool markings on them. That might be an auger, a brace and bit that was used to drill down, or some telltale that puts us in the historical context of the last 300 years. The oldest known canoe that we can confirm would be a birch bark canoe that turns up in a barn in Cornwall, England, or Cornwall in UK. And it was acquired during the American Revolution. And that's really surprising because birch bark canoes left to the weather don't survive. They slowly just unfurl in the natural environment as the root lashings that hold them together just slowly come undone. The hull is spring-loaded and it just releases itself back into the earth. But also birch bark canoes in this country don't seem to last very long because they were used, and they were used hard and put away wet, if you will. Whereas in Europe, and in the UK in this case, it was something of a novelty, and they would end up in a great hall or in a barn or under an eave somewhere if they survived. So we often see the oldest ones there. So 1770s would be the oldest known canoe currently in our collection. And that would make it, I should add, one of the oldest known birch bark canoes in the world.
We're so lucky. So when did the industrial era really take off and take the place of artisan makers?
Well, okay. It's interesting because as an industry, building with wood canoes, the artisanry endured because you could never quite mass produce this stuff. It still required that skill, and I think you could argue that with early car manufacturing and everything else, but you still needed the expertise of somebody working with this and adjusting to get that fit. Now, there was a moment locally, there were a lot of these small shops happening, as I was mentioning, in the 1860s and 1870s. In 1883, the American Canoeing Association moved up to Peterborough, to north of us on Stony Lake, for their annual assembly. It was the first time they'd held a meet outside of the United States, and it was a really big deal. It put Peterborough area on the map to a much larger market. This was an international gathering that was happening on Stony. And it coincided with the first year of the Ontario Canoe Company. John Stevenson, remember that name from earlier on, he had a hand in this. They were working with his patents. And 1883 was the beginning of that first major canoe factory in the area. And so I guess maybe that was a tipping point. And then it's not, well, Ontario Canoe Company burns down in 1892. As they all do, and that seems to be a running joke tonight. But it's immediately after the Peterborough Canoe Company opens in Peterborough, and a host of others are starting to open and blossom there. So then it's really shifting from the small independent sort of innovators like, John Stevenson operating alone, to this much more factory setting. And it's not before long that you see the layers, the stratigraphy of a factory brought to this method. So you have a boxcar with a train line coming in next to it, cedar being unloaded on the ground floor. It goes through the milling process, goes to the next floor where the molds are, and the builders build the hulls and they trim them out. Gets up to the third floor where they're sanded down and varnished. And then they're wrapped in, then they're carried down and they're wrapped in straw and burlap. And they're put on a box car that takes them maybe to Montreal, that puts it on a steamer that then takes it down around the Horn all the way to New Zealand or Australia. Or as I was saying the other day, we get correspondence from all around the world, and recently heard of a canoe turning up in the Somme in France. It arrived there in 1916, and I don't think it had anything meaningful to do with the offensive there, but this stuff, that kind of reach and range would never have happened from a small builder. So I'd say probably 1883. Ken Brown, I'm sure you'll correct me on that one, but that might be the tipping point.
So do we have any canoes made from synthetic materials in the museum? For example, plastic, Kevlar, carbon fiber? You
bet. Yeah, we have loads of them. We have some really groovy plastic fantastics from the 60s and 70s, where not only are they looking at different materials, but also all kinds of experimental hulls that are easier to produce in these new fabrics that are brought to bear. We have one of the oldest aluminum canoe manufacturers comes out of Chicoutimi, out of Saguenay, Lac Saint Jean area, and it was a aluminum sheet goods manufacturer during the war. And her name is the Silver Swan. It was made at the Chicoutimi, Saguenay? It would be the Saguenay Canoe Company. I hope I have that right. It's made out of welded aluminum, and it really sort of harkens on to an era that Grumman canoes would come to dominate. We also have all kinds of carbon fiber that takes us to the most recent Olympics. Well, to 2012 would be our most recent Olympics that's reflected. We have Mark Oldershaw's C1, where he's a fifth medalist, or fifth Olympian in his family, and he picked up a medal in that open canoe. That's carbon fiber, of course. So yes, we're not just a varnish and cedar museum by any stretch. The canoe takes you to all kinds of wonderful places.
This is a question about paddles, so shifting gears a little bit. Do you know any background on oval shaft paddles? This is by Don Harbin.
Well, yes. You can see we have some beautiful paddles that come from Alaska. They were Umiak paddles, and these are used for paddling. They're a single blade used in paddling canoes, and the Umiak, which is a large open boat made with bearded seal stretched over a large wooden frame, might hold 10 or 15 people. And those very clearly have an oval shaft to them. It's not a recent innovation. Of course, it gives you a better sense of orientation in the hand if the grip at the top is not doing that as well. It allows you to reduce a bit of weight and still have the stiffness in the shaft. But I don't really have a great answer for you that says this is a moment where this happens. It flourishes in different Indigenous traditions, and Walter's paddles are round. There's no oval to that whole method. Those were really a dowel shaft, although they taper, but they were a rounded form. So you will see variety, and it's probably a preference from what I can tell.
This question comes from Barry McDougall. How did the museum acquire the canoe or kayak from the Indigenous New Brunswick band, the Maliseet?
There are several here. One was everything in the museum was through donation, and several of these came from the High Collection out of New York. One from a private donor. I'm trying to think now to the provenance records. I'll have to get back to you on that, but by donation.
Okay, and I think this might be our last question of the night, unless any more come in. But from Peter Callens, a question I've always personally wondered. With the ribs in canoes, how did people typically manage kneeling for so long without damaging their knees?
I still have that problem. Usually I'll bundle up a sweater because of course I'm wearing a life jacket, a PFD, and it's not under my knees. That's a good question. And there was a lot of effort, if you look at the wood manufacturing, to clean up the interiors of them, to get rid of all of the wooden clutter of the framing, in part for the comfort of the paddlers. But so the cedar rib construction that we looked at, there was another method that basically almost looks like a dugout canoe, except it's made of layers of wood that had a completely smooth interior. The Cedar Strip canoes that we were bending a rib on one earlier, what they did is they put floorboards in the bottom of the canoe, whether these were big broad planks or these were long narrow strips, and they were laddered together. They gave you sort of a floating surface above the ribs that was kinder to your knees. Good question.
Well, I think that was our last question for the evening from the chat. But I just want to note that it looked like at the height, I think we had 71 participants, and some of the places named in the chat that you might not have gotten to see are, we had people from Ottawa, Austin, Texas, Georgina, Ontario, again, Ottawa, Toronto, Raleigh, North Carolina, Kansas City, Missouri, Lindsay, Ontario, Montreal, Blue Hill, Maine, Sacramento, California, Scotland, as we said, and Pittsburgh. So, I mean, just really amazing. And Kenora, Ontario, people from all over that also wouldn't have been able to visit us, which is just so nice.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I'm really glad all of you came to join us tonight. I'm sorry that the COVID precautions have reduced our opening down to 3 days a week, but it's great to, in a way, to meet you online. And we'll be doing more of these. And I hope in fullness of time, if you haven't visited the Canoe Museum, that you make an effort to come down and see us. We'd love to meet you here.
Awesome. And also Duro Dummer. We had Carolyn shouting out there as well.
Duro.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. And I think, Karen, did you want to share a little bit about the recording?
Oh, yes, I guess I can do that. I was just staying out of the way with my mask there, but Jeremy's making a retreat. So, yeah, so we will send out a recording of this webinar tomorrow afternoon or the next day, depending on how quickly I can turn it around. And that'll be live for a couple of weeks if you want to watch it again. Also for anyone who couldn't make it tonight, who registered, will get that recording as well. And we will do another one of these probably in January after we all, have our Christmas celebrations and busyness for what it is this year. And so we'll probably send out to everyone who registered for this one to see if you're interested in joining us again. I hope I'll see you either then or in the museum itself in the coming weeks. So thank you all. And thank you, Jeremy and Marcella, for holding it down on the chat end as well. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Have a great night.